The whirlwind that tears through the battlefield is not a weather phenomenon. The mountain that suddenly shifts to crush an expedition is not experiencing an earthquake. The inferno that consumes a village does not spread by accident. These are the elemental's beings that represent the most fundamental truth of existence, that reality itself is alive, conscious, and entirely indifferent to mortal survival. In the vast and varied cosmology of the multiverse, few entities are as fundamentally alien yet intrinsically vital as the elementals. They are the raw, unbridled incarnations of the elements that compose existence itself. As beings composed entirely of the four classical elements, air, earth, fire, and water, they are as wild and dangerous as the primordial forces that birthed them. To study the elemental is to study the foundational building blocks of reality, a pursuit that has consumed the minds of ancient empires, dark cults, and modern artificers alike. What distinguishes the elemental from every other category of monster is not merely power or origin. Dragons possess ancient intelligence. Demons embody malevolence. Undead pervert the natural order. But elementals exist on a different axis entirely. They are not corruptions of nature or deviations from cosmic law. They are nature. They are cosmic law. When a wizard summons an air elemental, the spell does not create a monster. It gives temporary form and direction to a concept that predates civilization, that predates life itself, that will endure long after the last mortal draws their final breath. The fundamental nature of elementals renders them incomprehensible to mortal understanding. Unlike mortal creatures, an elemental does not possess a dual nature. Its soul and its physical body form a single, inseparable unit. Consequently, when an elemental is slain, no soul is left loose in the cosmos, rendering spells designed to restore souls to bodies completely ineffective. The implications of this singular truth ripple through every interaction mortals have with these beings. Resurrection magic fails. Speak with dead produces no answers. The elemental simply ceases, returning to the undifferentiated energy from which it temporarily emerged. Furthermore, their physiology grants them immunity to poisons, sleep, paralysis, and stunning, and they are not subject to critical hits or flanking. They have absolutely no biological need to eat, sleep, or breathe. These are not magical protections or supernatural defenses. These immunities exist because the very concepts that give rise to such vulnerabilities have no meaning when applied to living wind or animate stone. A poison requires a metabolism to corrupt. Sleep demands a biology that experiences fatigue. Paralysis affects muscles and nerves that elementals do not possess. The elemental exists beyond these categories, occupying a space in the natural order that mortals can observe and exploit, but never truly comprehend. This exploration will reveal the hidden nature of these primal forces, the pure elementals and their devastating combat tactics. The philosophies and religions that have arisen around elemental worship, including the catastrophic civil war that destroyed an entire civilization, the industrial exploitation of elementals as living batteries powered by stolen secrets and crystalline prisons, the mortals who have chosen to merge their flesh with elemental essence, becoming living hybrids, and finally, the bizarre variants and the infinite planes from which all elementals ultimately emerge. Among the four primary types of true elementals, the air and earth varieties demonstrate most clearly the alien combat methodologies these beings employ. An air elemental appears as an amorphous, shifting cloud surrounded by fast-moving currents of air. Darker bits of swirling vapor form the suggestion of two eyes and a mouth, though this may merely be a trick of the swirling air. They speak Auran, their voices sounding like the high-pitched screech of a tornado or the low moan of a midnight storm, though they rarely choose to speak. Communication implies relationship. Relationship implies commonality. The air elemental shares nothing with those who summon it except temporary proximity and mutual exploitation. Air elementals are among the swiftest and most agile creatures in existence, rarely leaving their home plane except when summoned by a spell. In combat, their rapid speed makes them exceptionally useful on vast battlefields or in extended aerial combat. They possess an innate ability known as air mastery, meaning that airborne creatures suffer penalties when attacking them. The air itself bends to their will, creating turbulence and resistance that makes striking them extraordinarily difficult. A dragon in flight, master of its domain for centuries, becomes clumsy and uncertain when facing an air elemental. The very medium through which it moves betrays it in favor of a being that is not merely in the air, but is the air. Their most devastating tactic is the ability to transform themselves into a whirlwind. An elemental can maintain this form for an extended period, sweeping up smaller creatures into its body. The victims are not merely buffeted by winds, they are drawn into the elemental's substance, spun at velocities that shatter bone and tear flesh, surrounded by debris that acts as countless cutting implements. If the whirlwind's base touches the ground, it creates a swirling cloud of debris that obscures all vision, effectively blinding those caught within its dark radius and severely hindering the casting of spells. The wizard who thought to control the wind suddenly finds that the carefully articulated gestures required for spell completion are impossible when the caster cannot see their own hands, cannot maintain balance, cannot draw breath without inhaling sand and stone. Earth elementals present an entirely different paradigm of elemental warfare. Native to the elemental plane of Earth, they are beings of immense, unyielding strength. They possess a natural Earth mastery, granting them superior combat prowess when both they and their foes are touching the ground. The inverse of the air elemental's advantage, this ability transforms any terrestrial battlefield into the Earth elemental's absolute domain. The knight, in full plate armor, standing firm with shield braced, discovers that firmness and stability mean nothing when the ground itself has become the enemy. Furthermore, Earth elementals possess the supernatural ability known as Earth Glide. This allows an Earth elemental to glide through stone, dirt, or almost any other sort of earth except for metal as easily as a fish swims through water. Their burrowing leaves behind no tunnel or hole, nor does it create any ripple or other signs of its presence. The stone does not part. The earth does not shift. The elemental simply exists in one location and then exists in another, passing through solid matter as though the concept of solidity itself is negotiable. This ability renders conventional fortifications meaningless. Castle walls provide no protection. Underground vaults offer no security. The earth elemental attacks from below, from within, from directions that should not exist as directions. The tactical implications of these abilities have shaped military doctrine across multiple planes. Generals who plan for conventional combat sword against sword, spell against spell, find their strategies reduced to useless theory when elementals enter the battlefield. The earth elemental that glides beneath an army's formation to emerge in the midst of vulnerable spellcasters. The air elemental that lifts siege equipment into the sky before dropping it back to earth as shattered wreckage. These are not monsters to be fought. They are fundamental problems of physics and reality that must be solved through equally fundamental alterations to the combat environment. Armies that survive elemental assault do so not through superior fighting, but through superior understanding of which terrains can be controlled and which must be abandoned entirely. The raw power of the elements has inspired deep philosophical and religious devotion across the planes. The doctrine of pure elementalism was born millennia ago on the original planet of the Alphatians. For centuries, it remained the basic philosophy of the Alphatian spellcasters, who eschewed traditional schools of magic to devote themselves exclusively to one of 4 elemental schools. Elementalists are expert mages who learn to protect themselves from, summon, and ultimately control the elements, with grandmasters gaining the ability to transform themselves into elemental creatures and freely travel to elemental planes. There exist 4 elemental academies, one for each natural element: air, earth, fire, and water, and they operate as fierce rival orders. A strict law of elemental opposition governs them. An elementalist is absolutely prohibited from learning spells linked to their opposing element, nor can they use magic items that reproduce effects based on that element. This is not mere tradition or academic preference. The philosophy of elemental opposition holds that each element exists in a state of fundamental tension with its counterpart. Fire opposes water, air opposes earth. To embrace both sides of this cosmic equation is to embrace contradiction, to dilute one's connection to the primal truth, to render oneself a generalist when mastery demands absolute specialization. Tragically, this theory of elemental opposition brought the ancient Alphatians to disaster. A bitter philosophical dispute over which of the four primary elements of the universe was the most powerful eventually escalated into a full-scale civil war between the followers of air and the followers of fire. This was not a war fought over territory or resources or political succession. This was a war fought over metaphysical truth. The followers of air argued that air was the first breath of creation, the medium through which all other elements move and interact. The followers of fire countered that fire was the transformative force, the power that changes earth to lava, water to steam, that releases the potential locked within all matter. This devastating conflict completely destroyed old Alphatia and forced the survivors into exile. The specific details of the war's conclusion have been lost to history or deliberately suppressed, but the results speak with sufficient clarity. An entire planetary civilization, possessing magical knowledge that modern archmages would sacrifice kingdoms to obtain, tore itself apart over a question that can never be empirically answered. Today, the pure elementalist is a mystical tradition reserved to a few circles of initiates who practice their arts discreetly due to lingering suspicion. The surviving Alphatian cultures regard elementalism with the same mixture of reverence and terror that other societies reserve for necromancy or demonology, not because the practice is inherently evil, but because the historical precedent proves it is inherently dangerous. In other realms, religious orders venerate the elements directly. A church dedicated to an earth deity might preach that earth is the preeminent element, the source of all strength and life that carries the water, absorbs the wind, and is unharmed by fire. Such groups teach that the earth was the first creation brought forth from the void, and they believe that complete peace comes only from emulating the patience, solidity, and resilience of soil and stone. These are not abstract philosophical positions. These churches produce paladins who can walk through fire unharmed because they have achieved such perfect alignment with earth that flame cannot find purchase. They produce clerics whose healing magic functions by reinforcing the body's connection to the ground, treating injury as a form of disconnection from the fundamental stability that earth provides. Conversely, the forces of the elemental prince Imix embody the destructive, consuming nature of fire. Led by fiends and creatures of elemental fire loyal to Imix, armies of monsters actively seek out elemental wellsprings of water to destroy them. Through foul rites involving the fiery sacrifice of sentient beings and creatures of water, these forces corrupt the conduits of the wells, reshaping them to draw upon the elemental plane of fire in a bid to make the world ever hotter. This is not conquest in the traditional sense. Imix's followers do not seek to rule the material plane. They seek to transform it, to convert temperate lands into burning deserts, oceans into steam, forests into ash. The goal is not dominion, but conversion, the remaking of one element into another, the ultimate expression of fire's transformative power taken to its apocalyptic conclusion. In the world of Eberron, the relationship between mortals and elementals is strictly industrial. The gnomes of Zilargo have pioneered a myriad of thaumaturgical workings to harness the sheer power of elementals. House Orion, famed for its lightning rail, and House Lyrandar, masters of airships and galleons, rely heavily on vessels powered by bound elementals. This represents a fundamental shift in how mortals interact with these primal forces. Elementals are not revered as gods, feared as invaders, or studied as cosmic mysteries. They are fuel, they are engines, they are natural resources to be extracted, processed, and consumed. Contrary to gnome assertions, the artificers of Zilargo did not invent the binding process. The techniques behind elemental binding were absent until 793 YK, roughly 1200 years ago. The true origin of this magic is a heavily guarded secret of the Trust, Zilargo's infamous intelligence network. The story begins with a gnome explorer named Bernid Dojern, who discovered an ancient Zendrick journal detailing a new form of arcane magic. Realizing that the wielders of this magic lived on the continent of secrets, Bernard secured funding from the doyen of the High Council and led an expedition into the jungles of Zendrik. There he encountered Moranzabad, a drow clan living within the ruins of an ancient giant empire. Through flowery words of friendship and lavish gifts, Bernard won the trust of the drow leader. Over many weeks, the gnomes and the drow exchanged knowledge. The Dark Elves revealed amazing weapons and armor enhanced by bound elementals, explaining that this arcane knowledge was passed from the dragons to the giants in a time before memory. The revelation carried profound implications. Elemental binding was not a recent innovation or a clever application of contemporary magical theory. It was ancient knowledge, originating with the dragons' beings who existed before mortal civilizations, who possessed inherent understanding of magic that mortals must laboriously study. The giants, themselves an empire of continent-spanning power, had inherited this knowledge and built their civilization upon it. As Bernard secretly copied the ancient texts, Moranzabad discovered the gnomish treachery. Bernard and a small fraction of his expedition barely managed to escape, leaving the rest to die fighting the enraged drow. Sick with a wound that became infected, Bernard died shortly after handing the copied manuscripts to the doyen, while the drow leader swore a blood oath that every gnome is cursed until their stolen magic is returned. This curse is not metaphorical. Drow assassins still hunt Zil artificers across the world, viewing each bound elemental as proof of ongoing theft, each airship as a monument to betrayal. The Industrial Revolution of Eberron, the lightning rails that connect cities, and the airships that patrol the skies all rest upon a foundation of espionage, murder, and a curse that will never be lifted because the stolen magic will never be returned. The process of binding an elemental requires specific magic and the use of a Kyber dragon shard. The shard serves two critical functions. First, it acts as the focal point for an arcane matrix, a lattice of energy that traps the elemental. The ordered structure of the crystal essentially forms a maze with no exit, which the elemental follows endlessly as long as it remains bound. The elemental does not comprehend its imprisonment. It simply moves, as air moves through canyons, as water flows through riverbeds, following the path of least resistance that the crystal's structure provides. That this path loops eternally back upon itself is irrelevant to a being that possesses no concept of freedom or captivity, only existence and motion. Second, the shard acts as a conduit for the elemental's raw energy. As the elemental is forced through the crystalline lattice of the arcane matrix, it gives off energy, which is then transferred to power the airship or item. The concept is similar to how a conductor stone allows lightning rails to move, except the conductor stone is the elemental, and the matrix is the Kyber shard at its heart. The elemental does not fatigue. It does not require fuel or rest. It simply is, and in being, it produces energy as a consequence of its nature. This makes bound elementals the perfect engine, eternal, powerful, and requiring nothing except the magical prison that contains them. If a dragon shard is shattered, the elemental is immediately freed, and is invariably quite enraged. The airship plummets from the sky, the lightning rail grinds to a halt, and the elemental, finally released from its maze, remembers the beings who imprisoned it. The line between mortal flesh and elemental spirit is not always absolute. Across various planes, individuals have sought to merge their physical forms with elemental essence. In Zalargo, a group known as the Power of Purity, or the Inmost, specializes in binding elementals. However, their true innovation is the creation of elemental scions. Led by a gnome ranger named Agre Fafek Earthheart, these scions believe in the truths of elemental unity and actively bind elementals into their own living bodies. These elemental grafts give the bearing creatures a highly alien look. The graft donors are either willing participants harvested for their ability or summoned elementals bound by magic. A scion might possess an aqueous body, where the essential substance of a water elemental replaces portions of their flesh, turning their veins a faint blue, and granting them the ability to seamlessly evade underwater attacks and breathe water indefinitely. The transformation is not superficial. The scion's blood becomes partially liquid elemental essence. Their lungs process water as efficiently as air. When wounded, they bleed streams that flow upward as easily as down, responding to currents that normal biology cannot detect. Another might possess the breath of the waves, replacing the inside of their mouth and tongue with water elemental substance, rendering their teeth translucent as ice and ensuring they never fear thirst. The practical applications extend beyond mere survival. A scion with this graft can speak underwater without difficulty, can taste the mineral content of water to determine its source, can detect poison in liquids by flavor alone, but the cost is permanent alienation from normal existence. Food loses all flavor. Wine tastes identical to seawater. The simple pleasure of a meal becomes a purely functional act of consuming nutrients that the elemental portions of their anatomy process without joy or satisfaction. The creation of these living elemental hybrids requires complex negotiation, as the scion must accept the graft as a potential life force worth nurturing. This is not a simple surgical procedure or magical transplantation. The elemental essence must be convinced to accept its new role, to integrate with mortal flesh, rather than simply replacing it. Some scions report that they can feel the elemental presence within them as a distinct consciousness, not intelligent enough to qualify as a separate personality, but aware enough to resist or cooperate with the host body's intentions. A scion with a fire elemental graft might find that their flames burn hotter when they are angry, that the elemental essence responds to emotional states that the pure elemental would never experience. In the lands of the Diamond Throne, individuals can choose to become elemental scions through a mysterious convergence. The strength of earth, the ferocity of fire, the speed of wind, and the tenacity of waves come together in a living mortal. All four elements work together within the creature, united by the mortal spirit, the fifth element, in synthesis rather than opposition. This transformation bolsters the scion with earth, grants them the agility of fire, allows them to float upon the air, and permits them to breathe water. Unlike the Zalargo scions, who incorporate fragments of a single element, the Diamond Throne scions embody all four simultaneously. This represents a philosophical rejection of the elemental opposition theory that destroyed the Alphatians. Rather than arguing which element is supreme, rather than specializing in one aspect at the exclusion of all others, the Diamond Throne scions embrace totality. They argue that the mortal spirit is itself an element, the organizing principle that allows contradictory forces to coexist. Without consciousness to mediate between them, fire and water destroy each other. Earth and air remain forever separate. But within the scion's body, guided by will and intention, all four elements achieve harmony. The reverence for the elements extends into the natural and divine realms. A druid, who traditionally reveres the flora and fauna of nature, can instead forego their bond with the animal kingdom to take on an elemental creature as their loyal companion, paying respect to the fundamental building blocks of the natural world. This represents a significant sacrifice. The druid abandons the companionship of the wolf, the eagle, the bear creatures that possess loyalty, affection, and recognizable intelligence. In exchange, they bond with a being of living fire or animated stone, a companion that will never understand affection, never demonstrate loyalty as mammals understand it, but will serve with the absolute reliability of a natural law. In the celestial spheres, there exist angels of the elements. These magical beings, tied to the four basic natural elements, are celestial forces of good. Operating individually or in small groups without rigid hierarchies, they undertake self-driven quests to watch over places in danger, help regions racked by famine, or guide animals out of forest fires. To aid them in their benevolent tasks, these angels possess the innate, spell-like ability to summon medium or large elementals with a near absolute chance of success. The philosophy underlying this power reveals the celestial perspective on elementals. The angels do not view elementals as monsters to be controlled or resources to be exploited. They view them as colleagues different in nature, alien in thought, but united in the fundamental task of maintaining the balance of existence. The cosmic influences of the multiverse have resulted in numerous bizarre offshoots of elemental life, each adapted to unique environments or corrupted by outside planes. Elemental weirds are cryptic beings of elemental force who serve as powerful oracles, soothsayers, and seers of knowledge past, present, and future. Composed of material from one of the four elements, a weird resides in a secluded pool of its appropriate element, which it can never leave. The upper body of a weird always resembles that of a beautiful female humanoid, while the lower half is a serpentine column that connects directly to its pool. Weirds have special knowledge of the particular aspect of fate with which their element is associated. They can divine information that could change the very course of history, though their messages are often confusing or difficult to decipher. Air weirds offer direction and guidance to those traveling into unknown areas. Appearing as translucent women composed of flowing vapors with deep blue eyes and wind-blown hair, they reside in pools filled with billowing, gusting vapors of breathable air. Their prophecies concern journeys, explorations, and the paths that individuals must take to reach their destinies. Earth weirds are foretellers of death and doom, warning of coming apocalypses or prognosticating wealth and fortune. Resembling a woman with sparkling gemstones for eyes and brown earth-streaked hair, an earth weird's lower body is a shifting column of stone and dirt connected to a churning pool of mud and rocks. Their prophecies deal with endings, the death of kings, the fall of nations, the exhaustion of mines, the collapse of mountains. They speak of what the earth will reclaim, what will be buried, what will endure. If forced into combat, weirds attempt to avoid physical confrontation, instead using an ability called Elemental Command to seize control over any elementals within 100 feet, turning them against their foes. This ability reveals the hierarchical nature of elemental existence. The weird, a more evolved and specialized form of elemental life, possesses inherent authority over the simpler, more primal elementals. The summoned fire elemental that a wizard thought to control suddenly finds itself subject to a more fundamental command, forced to turn upon its summoner by a being whose connection to elemental truth supersedes mortal magic. Native to the elemental plane of air, the Belker is a mass of dark smoke that moves against the breeze. When attacking, this cloud-like, roiling mass suddenly explodes into a demonic creature of smoke and wind, complete with large bat wings, clawed tendrils, and a biting maw. Composed primarily of smoke, they are undeniably evil and reclusive. The Belker represents a disturbing truth about elementals that alignment and moral character can manifest even in beings that possess no traditional biology or society. The Belker is not evil because it was taught to be evil or because it serves an evil deity. It is evil because malevolence has somehow become intrinsic to its elemental nature, as fundamental to its existence as combustion is fundamental to fire. Belkers have the terrifying ability to engulf opponents in their smoke form, solidifying the smoke inside the victim's lungs to rip at their surrounding organs from the inside out. The victim does not suffocate. Suffocation would be a mercy. Instead, they experience their own respiratory system transformed into a weapon against them, their lungs filled with matter that is simultaneously insubstantial enough to have entered their body and solid enough to shred tissue. Death comes from internal hemorrhaging, from lungs that have been reduced to torn meat, from a method of killing that leaves external observers baffled as to the cause. Shadow elementals are creatures of living shade, brought into being from the dark stuff of the plane of shadow. They appear as nebulous forms of ever-shifting gloom, trailing smoky wisps, and moving soundlessly to drain the light as they pass. In combat, they lash out at living creatures with smoky tendrils that are as insubstantial as the darkness itself. These elusive creatures rarely roam the material plane of their own free will, usually only manifesting when summoned. Uncontrolled shadow elementals are incredibly hostile to both illumination and living beings not native to shadow, making every effort to extinguish light and life. Shadow elementals understand the commands of their summoners, but they never seem to communicate in any manner. The existence of shadow elementals raises profound questions about the nature of elemental categorization. Shadow is not one of the four classical elements. It is not a building block of physical reality, but rather the absence of light, a negative space given form. That such beings can exist, that they can be summoned and controlled through magic similar to that used for true elementals, suggests that the four-element model is incomplete. Shadow elementals hint at the existence of para-elemental and quasi-elemental planes, regions where the classical elements blend with positive and negative energy to create hybrid states of existence. In fantasy worlds where magic reigns, the cataclysmic impact of a falling meteorite can occasionally open brief, intense portals to the elemental planes of fire and earth. In these fleeting moments, elemental spirits of earth and fire are sucked into the just-born meteorite bombs. Even after the meteorite has fallen and cooled, these spirits remain, transforming into molten elementals. They haunt the impact site in a state of quiescence, but if disturbed by trespassers such as those attempting to harvest meteoritic iron, they become animate and fiercely molten once more to defend their territory. These beings represent elementals created through cosmic accident, their existence a byproduct of planar mechanics rather than intentional summoning or natural manifestation. Among psionic manifestors, certain lesser elementals known as elemental stewards are highly prized as envoys and indispensable companions. These creatures can be summoned via psionic powers to fight on their master's behalf. There are four primary varieties: the Arctine of cold, the Emberling of fire, the Geodite of sonic vibration, and the Tempestan of electricity. Interestingly, some elemental stewards are not purely composed of the element of the plane they inhabit. The Tempestan inhabits the elemental plane of air, but is fundamentally a creature of electricity. This reveals that the elemental planes themselves are more complex than simple repositories of a single element, that they contain gradations and specializations, subcategories of elemental existence that occupy specific ecological niches. The Emberlings, which take sustenance directly from heat, require standing for 10 minutes within a fire at least as hot as a torch to receive a day's nourishment. In battle, an Emberling will utilize an energy ray of fire and a psionic daze ability to mesmerize its victims with dancing flames. The combination of elemental power and psionic ability demonstrates that elementals can serve as the foundation for entirely new categories of magical creature, beings that blur the line between elemental and construct, between summoned spirit and psychic manifestation. To truly understand elementals, one must look to the infinitely expansive inner planes from which they originate. The elemental plane of water is a boundless ocean. Amidst the eternal waters, spherical balls of seaweed and coral float freely, serving as the lairs of outsiders and fish-like humanoids. The preeminent rulers of this plane are the Marids, fiercely independent genies who maintain a massive empire of semi-independent strongholds. The center of this empire is the Citadel of 10,000 Pearls, the seat of the Coral Throne, where the great Padishah of the Marid rules. For travelers who breathe air, the City of Glass serves as an ideal gathering spot. This cosmopolitan free port consists of a massive sphere of unbreakable glass, half filled with water and half with air. It is ruled by a council of long-time residents and is heavily populated by Mercanes, Marids, Dao, and human traders who conduct their business through the city's numerous magical portals. The City of Glass represents a crucial truth about the elemental planes, that they are not merely sources of raw material or spawning grounds for monsters, but functional societies with economies, politics, and cultures as complex as anything found on the material plane. The plane of water is also haunted by the Avenger, a legendary, unique figure. Appearing as a colossal, dark gray manta ray measuring 180 feet from wingtip to wingtip, the Avenger propels itself through the water with a battery of water screws and discharges lightning bolts at will. Theories abound regarding its nature. Some consider it a powerful construct running wild, while Lokatha pirates claim it is a rebellious vehicle manned by human specters. The Avenger has been sighted across millennia, always appearing in the same form, always displaying the same behaviors, never communicating with any creature that approaches it. The mystery of the Avenger encapsulates the fundamental unknowability of the elemental planes. Here is a creature or construct or entity that has existed for thousands of years, that possesses power sufficient to threaten entire fleets, that operates according to motivations that remain completely opaque despite centuries of study. Scholars have written dissertations attempting to explain the Avengers' purpose. Adventurers have died attempting to communicate with it or destroy it. And still, it swims through the infinite ocean, following patterns that may be ancient programming or may be the behavior of an intelligence so alien that mortal minds cannot recognize it as intelligence at all. The elemental planes extend infinitely in every direction, each one an entire dimension composed of a single element taken to its absolute expression. The plane of fire is not a place that contains fire. It is fire in all its forms, from the gentle warmth of a candle to the nuclear fury of a star's core. The plane of Earth is not a planet or a cavern, but an infinite expanse of stone and soil and metal, where down is whichever direction the local gravity happens to indicate, where cities are carved into mountains that have no base because the mountain extends forever. Travel between these planes is possible through naturally occurring portals or through powerful magic, but survival requires either extensive preparation or the assistance of natives. A mortal who steps onto the plane of fire without protection combusts instantly. A mortal who enters the plane of water without the ability to breathe water drowns within minutes. The plane of Earth provides no air pockets, no caverns filled with breathable atmosphere. It is solid matter in all directions, and without the ability to earth glide or ethereal movement, the traveler is simply buried alive in an infinite tomb. Yet these planes are inhabited. Genies build palaces. Elementals congregate in patterns that might represent communities, or might simply be natural clustering driven by planar currents that mortals cannot perceive. Outsiders establish strongholds. Traders create markets. The elemental planes are not lifeless hells, but functioning ecosystems, albeit ecosystems where the fundamental rules of existence differ so drastically from the material plane that mortal visitors are as helpless as fish removed from water. The relationship between the elemental planes and the material plane remains a subject of intense scholarly debate. Some theorists argue that the elemental planes are the source material from which the material plane was constructed, that reality as mortals experience it is simply a mixture of all four elements in varying proportions. Others contend that the elemental planes are reflections or extremes, that the material plane is the true reality, and the elemental planes are what happens when you isolate and purify a single component to the exclusion of all others. Regardless of which theory is correct, the practical implications remain consistent. The elemental planes exist as vast reservoirs of primal power that can be tapped through summoning, binding, or direct planar travel. Every elemental that manifests on the material plane represents a tiny fragment of that power given temporary form. Every bound elemental powering an airship is a piece of infinity trapped in a crystal prison. Every elemental scion is a mortal who has chosen to internalize a fraction of that primal force, to become a living bridge between the mundane world and the elemental extremes. Whether encountered as a mindless, swirling vortex of wind bound tightly within the dragon-shard engine of a soaring airship, or grafted seamlessly into the flesh of a devout scion, the elemental remains a testament to the raw, untamed power of the cosmos. They are the indifferent, immortal engines of creation and destruction, providing both the foundation of the multiverse and the apocalyptic means to unmake it. The civilizations that have risen to power through elemental exploitation, the gnomes of Zalargo with their airships, the Alphatians with their elemental academies, demonstrate both the potential and the peril of treating these forces as tools rather than fundamental aspects of existence. The gnomes achieved an industrial revolution built on stolen dragon magic and imprisoned spirits. The Alphatians achieved mastery over the elements themselves and then destroyed their entire planet, arguing over which element deserved supremacy. Both outcomes flow from the same source: the mortal tendency to believe that understanding a thing grants ownership of it. The religious movements that worship elementals, or elemental deities, approach the same power from a different angle, acknowledging the primacy of these forces while attempting to align mortal behavior with elemental principles. The Earth Church that teaches patience and resilience. The Fire Cult that seeks to transform the world into a burning wasteland. These represent opposite poles of elemental devotion, one seeking harmony and the other seeking dominance, but both acknowledging that elementals are not merely powerful monsters, but rather expressions of cosmic law. The individuals who choose to merge with elemental essence, the scions of Zelargo binding water to flesh, the scions of the Diamond Throne synthesizing all four elements through mortal spirit, pursue a third path. They seek neither exploitation nor worship, but integration, attempting to transcend the boundary between mortal and elemental entirely. Whether this represents evolution or hubris remains an open question. The scion who can breathe water and walk through fire has gained capabilities that approach the divine. But they have also rendered themselves alien to their own species, created an internal landscape where living flame and flowing water must be mediated by conscious will every moment of every day. The strange variants, the Belkers with their intrinsic malevolence, the Weirds with their prophetic knowledge, the shadow elementals that exist in defiance of the four-element model, prove that elemental classification is more complex than ancient scholars believed. The existence of para-elemental and quasi-elemental planes, regions where elements blend or where elemental matter merges with positive or negative energy, suggests an entire cosmology of elemental states that remain largely unexplored. Each variant represents a doorway to further mysteries, further questions about the nature of elemental existence. The elemental planes themselves exist as infinite realms of pure elemental matter, hosting civilizations and ecosystems that function according to physical laws alien to material existence. The Citadel of 10,000 Pearls, the City of Glass, the Avenger swimming through eternal ocean. These are not decorative details, but evidence that the elemental planes support complex societies, that they are not merely resource deposits to be mined, but entire dimensions with their own histories and futures. In the end, the fundamental nature of elementals defies complete understanding. They are simultaneously the simplest and most complex entities in the multiverse. Simple because they are pure expressions of single concepts. Fire burns, water flows, earth endures, air moves. Complex because those concepts, when taken to their infinite extreme, generate behaviors and capabilities that mortal logic cannot predict. The air elemental that transforms into a whirlwind is not employing a supernatural ability, it is simply being air, fully and completely, in a way that happens to destroy everything nearby. This irreducible alienness ensures that elementals will never be truly domesticated, never rendered completely safe, never fully controlled, regardless of how sophisticated the binding magic becomes. The Kyber dragon shard that imprisons the elemental in an eternal maze remains one crack away from catastrophic failure. The scion who has integrated elemental essence into their flesh remains one moment of lost concentration away from internal war between incompatible forces. The elementalist wizard who summons an air elemental to fight on the battlefield remains one dispelled spell away from discovering whether the elemental chooses to leave peacefully or to remain and settle accounts. The elementals endure as the primal forces of the multiverse, indifferent to mortal ambition, immune to mortal morality, incomprehensible to mortal psychology. They were the first powers to manifest when the cosmos began. They will be the last powers remaining when the cosmos ends. Between that beginning and that ending, mortals can study them, summon them, bind them, worship them, merge with them, or flee from them. But mortals cannot change them. The fire will always burn. The water will always flow. The earth will always endure. The air will always move. These are not choices the elementals make. These are what the elementals are. And in that eternal, unchanging nature lies both their ultimate limitation and their absolute power.